September 21, 1976. Bernardo Leighton, a 68-year-old Chilean politician living in exile, walked slowly through the streets of Rome with his wife Anita. It was early evening, the sky darkening over the ancient city. They were returning to their apartment after visiting friends, walking a route they had taken dozens of times before. Rome felt safe. They were thousands of miles from the dictatorship that had forced them to flee Chile 3 years earlier. Europe was supposed to be sanctuary, a place where political refugees could rebuild their lives beyond the reach of the generals who had seized power back home. A man approached them on the quiet street. Without warning, he pulled a pistol and fired multiple shots at close range. Bernardo collapsed, a bullet lodged in his neck. Anita fell beside him, shot in the head. The assassin disappeared into the Roman twilight. By some miracle, both Bernardo and Anita survived, though their injuries would leave them permanently disabled. The attack seemed random, senseless, just another act of urban violence in a dangerous world. But it wasn't random at all. The shooter was an Italian neo-fascist named Stefano delle Chiaie, and he hadn't acted alone or for his own reasons. He had been contracted, paid, and directed by the Chilean secret police, the DINA, operating on foreign soil with the cooperation of other South American intelligence services. This was Operation Condor. Not a single event, but a coordinated system, a secret alliance between military dictatorships across South America that turned an entire continent into a hunting ground. For nearly a decade, from the mid-1970s into the 1980s, the governments of Argentina, Chile, Uruguay, Paraguay, Bolivia, and Brazil shared intelligence, coordinated operations, and tracked down their enemies wherever they fled. Political refugees who had escaped one dictatorship found themselves arrested in another country and rendered back to face torture and death. Dissidents living in Europe or the United States were assassinated by hit squads that crossed oceans to kill them. The traditional notion that borders provided protection, that exile meant safety, that international law constrained what governments could do beyond their territory, all of this dissolved. Operation Condor created a transnational apparatus of repression that treated the entire southern cone of South America as a single operational theater where suspected subversives could be hunted without restraint. To understand how this happened, how supposedly sovereign nations built a shared machinery for hunting and killing their own citizens across international borders, you have to understand the context of the Cold War in Latin America. By the 1970s, the region had become one of the most important battlegrounds in the global ideological struggle between capitalism and communism, between the United States and the Soviet Union. This wasn't a conflict fought with nuclear weapons or massive conventional armies facing each other across clear front lines. It was fought through coups and counter-coups, through insurgencies and counterinsurgency, through the rise and fall of governments, through the funding of political movements and the training of security forces. Latin America in the 1960s had seen the emergence of revolutionary movements inspired by the success of Fidel Castro in Cuba. Castro's revolution in 1959 had proven that a small group of dedicated guerrillas could overthrow an established government, that armed struggle could succeed where democratic reform had failed, that it was possible to break free from American economic domination and build an alternative system. This example electrified leftists across the continent. In country after country, armed movements emerged, committed to revolutionary change through violence. The Tupamaros in Uruguay, the Montoneros and ERP in Argentina, the MIR in Chile, smaller groups in Brazil, Bolivia, Paraguay. These movements carried out kidnappings, bank robberies to fund operations, assassinations of military officers and police, bombings of government buildings and corporate offices. The left-wing violence was real, and it was deadly. Business executives were kidnapped and held for ransom. American advisors and diplomats were targeted. Military officers were assassinated. The revolutionaries saw themselves as fighting against oligarchies, against American imperialism, against systems that kept the majority in poverty while enriching a small elite. They believed that the only path to fundamental change was through armed struggle, that the existing order would never reform itself peacefully, that violence was justified in pursuit of liberation. And they had some popular support, particularly among students, some labor unions, progressive clergy, and intellectuals who saw the revolutionary movements as the only real challenge to entrenched power. But from the perspective of Latin America's traditional elites, the military establishments, and the United States government, these movements represented an existential threat. This wasn't just about specific acts of violence. It was about the possibility that other countries might follow Cuba's example, that communism might spread across the hemisphere, that American influence and American business interests might be expelled from one country after another. The fear was that Latin America could be lost entirely to the communist bloc, becoming a constellation of Soviet allies on America's doorstep. The military establishments in these countries had been shaped by decades of American training and influence. Officers attended courses at the School of the Americas in Panama and later Georgia, where they learned counterinsurgency doctrine. They participated in exchange programs with the U.S. military. They absorbed a particular worldview that came to be called the National Security Doctrine. This doctrine redefined the nature of warfare for the Cold War era. The enemy was no longer primarily external, another nation-state that you fought at the borders. The enemy was internal, ideological, hidden within your own society. Communism wasn't just a foreign power. It was a subversive mentality that could infect anyone, your neighbor, your colleague, your student, your child. And because this enemy didn't wear a uniform or carry a flag, because it operated through ideas and organization rather than conventional military force, fighting it required different methods. The National Security Doctrine taught that this internal war required exceptional measures. Normal legal constraints had to be suspended. Democratic institutions, with their emphasis on individual rights and due process, were seen as vulnerabilities that the enemy could exploit. The rule of law became an obstacle to security. What was needed was decisive action, the willingness to do whatever was necessary to eliminate the threat before it could grow. This meant operating outside the law, beyond oversight, using methods that could never be officially acknowledged. It meant torture to extract information about networks and plans. It meant disappearance to eliminate enemies while avoiding the creation of martyrs that public executions would produce. It meant destroying not just armed guerrillas, but the entire social and political infrastructure that might support them, the unions, the student movements, the progressive churches, the intellectual circles, and crucially, this doctrine taught that the struggle transcended national boundaries. If a subversive fled from Chile to Argentina, they were still a threat. If a Uruguayan guerrilla found refuge in Brazil, they remained an enemy combatant. The fight against communism was continental, even global, and it required coordination between allied governments. National sovereignty, the principle that each country controlled what happened within its own borders, had to be subordinated to the larger imperative of defeating the communist threat. This was the ideological foundation that would make Operation Condor possible. The immediate catalyst for Condor's creation was the wave of military coups that swept across South America in the 1960s and 1970s. Brazil's military seized power in 1964, establishing a dictatorship that would last until 1985. Bolivia experienced a coup in 1971 under Hugo Banzer. Uruguay's democracy collapsed in 1973 as the military took direct control. Chile's coup came in September 1973 when General Augusto Pinochet overthrew the democratically elected socialist president Salvador Allende. Argentina's military, which had governed before, returned to power definitively in 1976. Paraguay had been under Alfredo Stroessner's dictatorship since 1954. By the mid-1970s, nearly the entire southern cone of South America was governed by anti-communist military regimes. These weren't coincidences or parallel developments happening in isolation. The militaries were in contact with each other. They shared intelligence, they observed each other's methods, and they faced a common problem. As each dictatorship began its campaign of repression, political activists, union leaders, guerrilla fighters, and ordinary citizens facing persecution did what refugees have always done. They fled across borders seeking safety. Chileans escaped to Argentina. Uruguayans fled to Chile or Brazil. Bolivians sought refuge in Peru or Argentina. Argentines who saw the coup coming left for Europe or neighboring countries. This created a dilemma for the new dictatorships. Their enemies, the people they most wanted to eliminate, were escaping beyond their reach. Traditional international law protected refugees. Countries couldn't simply send troops across borders to arrest people in other nations. Extradition procedures required evidence, legal processes, and were often denied for political crimes. The very borders that defined national sovereignty were allowing the people the dictatorships considered most dangerous to survive and potentially regroup. The solution was Operation Condor. The name itself came from the condor, the massive bird of prey that soars over the Andes Mountains that run like a spine down South America's western edge. The condor sees everything from great heights and strikes without warning. It was an appropriate symbol for a system of surveillance and assassination that would span a continent. The formal creation of Operation Condor is generally dated to November 1975, when intelligence chiefs from Chile, Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, and Bolivia met in Santiago. The meeting was organized by Manuel Contreras, the head of Chile's DINA, Pinochet's secret police force. Contreras was one of the most ruthless figures in a region full of brutal men. He had built DINA into an efficient machinery of repression, pioneering techniques of torture and disappearance that other countries would study and emulate. Now he proposed something more ambitious, a formal system where the intelligence services of the dictatorships would share information about suspected subversives, coordinate surveillance operations, and most critically, agree to arrest and transfer each other's enemies regardless of borders. The agreement they reached established several levels of cooperation. At the most basic level, Condor would function as an intelligence-sharing network. Each country would maintain a database of suspected subversives, their associates, their families, their habits, their networks. This information would be shared through a communications system that linked the intelligence agencies. If Chilean intelligence identified one of their targets living in Buenos Aires, they would notify their Argentine counterparts, who could place the person under surveillance. But Condor went far beyond passive information sharing. The second level involved active operations. If a country identified one of its citizens living as a refugee in another Condor member state, they could request that the host country arrest that person. This arrest would happen outside any legal framework. There would be no charges filed, no judicial oversight, no extradition hearing. The person would simply be kidnapped by the local intelligence service, transported secretly across the border, and handed over to their home country's security forces. Once in custody, they would disappear into the system of clandestine detention centers where torture and death awaited. The third and most extreme level involved assassination. For targets living outside South America, in Europe or the United States, where even friendly governments might not cooperate with illegal renditions, Condor countries would conduct joint assassination operations. They would share resources, provide cover identities, supply weapons, and coordinate logistics. The hit squads that carried out these assassinations often included operatives from multiple countries, making them truly multinational death squads. This system required infrastructure. Condor established a central database, initially housed in Chile and later expanded. Intelligence officers from member countries were stationed in each other's capitals, working directly with their counterparts. Communications were maintained through encrypted channels and a secure telex network. Some operations were coordinated through a computerized system that tracked suspects across borders, an early use of information technology for repression that was remarkably sophisticated for its time. Brazil joined Condor later, and with some reservations. The Brazilian military dictatorship was in some ways less overtly violent than its neighbors. It relied more on censorship, economic coercion, and selective repression rather than the mass disappearances that characterized Argentina or Chile. Brazilian intelligence participated in information sharing, but was more cautious about joint operations, particularly assassinations abroad. Still, Brazilian cooperation was valuable because of the country's size and the number of refugees who fled there. The United States government was aware of Operation Condor from very early on, probably from its inception. How much the U.S. knew when it knew it, and what level of support or acquiescence was provided, remains partially obscured because many relevant documents are still classified or heavily redacted. But what has been declassified makes clear that American intelligence agencies, particularly the CIA, tracked Condor's development, received reports about its operations, and chose not to interfere, despite knowing that Allied governments were conducting kidnappings and assassinations across international borders. The reasoning behind American tolerance of Operation Condor followed the same Cold War logic that had justified support for dictatorships throughout the developing world. The military regimes of South America were anti-communist. They had overthrown or prevented leftist governments. They were willing to use extreme violence to suppress revolutionary movements. From the perspective of American policymakers, still operating under the assumption that the Soviet Union and its allies were engaged in a zero-sum global struggle for dominance, these characteristics made the Southern Cone dictatorships valuable allies regardless of their human rights records. The calculation was brutally simple. Better a friendly authoritarian government that killed its own citizens than a hostile communist government that might align with Moscow. This position was most explicit during the Ford and Nixon administrations. Henry Kissinger, serving as Secretary of State, met with the architects of these dictatorships and gave them what they understood as tacit approval for their methods. When Kissinger met with Pinochet and Santiago in 1976, he told the Chilean dictator that the U.S. government's criticism of human rights violations was largely for domestic political consumption, that Pinochet shouldn't take it too seriously. The message was clear. Do what you need to do. We understand why it's necessary. Just try to be discreet about it. The election of Jimmy Carter in 1976 brought a shift in rhetoric, if not always in practice. Carter had made human rights a centerpiece of his foreign policy, arguing that American support for dictatorships betrayed American values and ultimately damaged American interests. The Carter administration did reduce some military aid, did speak out more forcefully about disappearances and torture, and did pressure the Southern Cone regimes through diplomatic channels. But the fundamental strategic relationship remained intact. Intelligence sharing continued. The framework that saw these dictatorships as necessary bulwarks against communism persisted even as the language around human rights became more prominent. When Ronald Reagan took office in 1981, even the rhetorical emphasis on human rights largely evaporated. The Reagan administration saw the Southern Cone dictatorships as experienced allies in the fight against communism, particularly as the U.S. intensified its involvement in Central America. Argentine military officers, with their experience in counterinsurgency and their proven willingness to use harsh methods, became advisors to the U.S.-backed governments and Contra forces fighting leftist insurgencies in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Nicaragua. The knowledge that these same officers had disappeared thousands of their own citizens was not seen as disqualifying. It was evidence of their commitment and their effectiveness. The first major Condor operation that came to public attention happened even before the formal Santiago meeting. In May 1975, two Uruguayan legislators who had been prominent critics of their country's military regime were living in exile in Buenos Aires. Zelmar Michelini was a senator who had fled Uruguay when the military took power. Hector Gutierrez Ruiz was a congressman and president of the Chamber of Representatives when the coup occurred. Both men were well-known public figures, not clandestine guerrillas but legitimate democratic politicians who had opposed the dictatorship through legal means. They believed that their prominence provided some protection, that assassinating serving or former legislators would be too scandalous even for military regimes. They were wrong. On the morning of May 18th, armed men seized both men from their homes in Buenos Aires. Michelini's wife watched helplessly as her husband was dragged away. The men were taken to a clandestine detention center where Uruguayan intelligence officers were waiting. They had been flown to Argentina specifically for this operation, with the full cooperation of Argentine security forces. Over the next days, both men were tortured. Their bodies were found on May 21st, dumped on roadsides outside Buenos Aires, bearing clear signs of torture, shot multiple times. Two other Uruguayan refugees were found dead the same day. The killings sent a message that resonated across the exile communities scattered throughout South America and beyond. Your prominence doesn't protect you. Your legal status as a refugee doesn't protect you. International borders don't protect you. The laws that supposedly govern relations between nations don't protect you. If we want you dead, you will die regardless of where you've fled. The message was understood. Exile, which had always been a form of escape from persecution, had become something else. You could run, but you were still within reach. The next major operation that revealed Condor's reach happened in Buenos Aires in 1976, targeting not South Americans, but Europeans who had come to the region for what they thought was humanitarian work. In December 1976, 12 people disappeared in Buenos Aires over a period of days. They included two French nuns, Alice Domon and Léonie Duquet, who worked in poor neighborhoods helping families search for disappeared relatives. Also taken were several of the founding members of the Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo, including Azucena Villaflor and Mary Ponce. Swedish teenager Dagmar Hagelin, who happened to be visiting a friend when security forces raided the apartment, was shot and kidnapped. 3 of those disappeared were members of the Catholic organization that advocated for social justice. All of these people were taken to ESMA, the Navy mechanics school that served as Buenos Aires's most notorious torture center. The nuns were kept alive for weeks, tortured, interrogated about their work with families of the disappeared. They were accused of supporting subversion by helping victims' families organize. In late December, they were among a group of prisoners loaded onto a military aircraft and thrown alive into the Rio de la Plata, the death flights that Argentina used to dispose of bodies without leaving evidence. The disappearance of foreign citizens, particularly religious women, from France, created international complications that the Argentine junta would have preferred to avoid. But the regime calculated correctly that protests from European governments would remain at the level of diplomatic complaints rather than actual consequences. The most brazen Operation Condor assassination, the one that finally brought international attention and scrutiny to the system, happened not in South America, but in Washington, D.C. On September 21, 1976, exactly the same date as the attack on Bernardo Leighton in Rome, a car bomb exploded on a quiet street in the American capital just blocks from the White House. The target was Orlando Letelier, who had served as foreign minister and defense minister under Salvador Allende in Chile before Pinochet's coup. After being imprisoned and tortured following the coup, Letelier had been released into exile and had become one of the most effective voices speaking out against the Chilean dictatorship. He worked at a Washington think tank, wrote articles, gave speeches, met with members of Congress, and lobbied for economic sanctions against Pinochet's regime. He was articulate, connected, and dangerous to the dictatorship precisely because he operated in the open, using democratic means to build international opposition to authoritarian rule. On that September morning, Letelier was driving to work with two American colleagues, Ronnie Moffett and her husband, Michael. A remote-controlled bomb that had been attached to the underside of Letelier's car detonated as they drove through the streets of Washington. The explosion was catastrophic. Letelier died almost instantly. Ronnie Moffett, sitting in the front passenger seat, was killed by shrapnel that severed her carotid artery. Michael Moffett, in the back seat, survived with injuries. The bombing occurred in broad daylight on American soil in the nation's capital. A former cabinet minister of a foreign government had been assassinated by that government's intelligence service on a street in Washington, D.C., and an American citizen had been killed as collateral damage. The assassination had been ordered by Manuel Contreras, planned by DINA officers, and carried out by a team that included both Chilean agents and American collaborators. The actual bomber was Michael Townley, an American who had become deeply embedded in Chilean intelligence operations. Townley had been born in the United States, but had lived in Chile for years and had become a trusted DINA operative. He built the bomb, traveled to Washington, surveilled Letelier's movements, planted the device under the car, and detonated it remotely. He worked with Cuban exile anti-Castro extremists who provided support and cover. The operation was multinational and sophisticated, requiring months of planning, international travel, coordination between intelligence services, and the creation of false identities and cover stories. The FBI investigation into the bombing initially struggled because the Chilean government denied any involvement and refused to cooperate. Pinochet's regime insisted that Letelier must have been killed by leftist rivals or that the bombing was a false flag operation designed to discredit Chile. But the investigators were persistent, and gradually they built a case. They traced the movements of the operatives, identified the bomb components, found witnesses, and eventually identified Townley as the bomber. In 1978, under enormous pressure from the U.S. government, Chile extradited Townley to face charges. He agreed to cooperate with prosecutors and provided detailed testimony about how DINA operated, how the assassination was planned, and who had ordered it. The Letelier case finally forced the American government and public to confront what the Southern Cone dictatorships were actually doing. This wasn't an abstract human rights issue happening in distant countries. This was a terrorist attack in Washington that killed an American citizen. Suddenly, the convenient fiction that these were merely authoritarian governments maintaining order in their own countries became impossible to sustain. They were conducting assassination operations on American soil. The church bombing in Birmingham, the assassination of Martin Luther King, the political violence of American history. This was that kind of act, except it was ordered by a foreign government that the United States considered an ally. The revelations about the Letelier assassination and Dina's role opened a window into Operation Condor's existence. As investigators dug deeper, as more documents surfaced, as witnesses came forward, the broader pattern became visible. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a systematic program. The military regimes of South America had created a multinational apparatus for hunting and killing their enemies across borders. Condor operations were identified in Argentina, Chile, Uruguay, Paraguay, Bolivia, Brazil, Peru, even in Europe and the United States. The scale was staggering. In Argentina alone, it's estimated that between 1976 and 1983, at least 300 Argentine refugees living in other countries were kidnapped through Condor operations and rendered back to Argentina, where they disappeared into the network of detention centers. The true number is likely higher because many cases were never documented. Uruguayan intelligence conducted operations throughout the region, tracking down Tupamaro guerrillas and left-wing activists who had fled when their movement was crushed. Chilean DINA agents operated in Argentina with such freedom that they essentially had their own offices and safe houses in Buenos Aires, conducting surveillance and kidnappings as if Argentine territory was an extension of Chile. One particularly chilling example of how Condor functioned involved a Uruguayan couple, Universindo Rodriguez and Lilian Celiberti, who were living in Porto Alegre, Brazil, with their 2 young children in 1978. Rodriguez was a member of the Tupamaros and was wanted by Uruguayan authorities. Brazilian intelligence, cooperating with Uruguay through Condor channels, located the family. But rather than simply arresting Rodriguez, they allowed Uruguayan intelligence officers to enter Brazil, conduct the operation themselves, and kidnap the entire family. The couple was taken across the border to Uruguay, where they were imprisoned and tortured. Their children, aged 3 and 8, were held separately, traumatized by witnessing their parents' abduction and not understanding what had happened. The case only became public because of the efforts of human rights organizations and because Brazil, even under dictatorship, had some journalists willing to investigate and report despite censorship. The Condor system was particularly active along the triple border region where Argentina, Paraguay, and Brazil meet. This area became a transit point for refugees trying to escape one dictatorship by fleeing through others. Intelligence services stationed operatives in the border towns, monitoring border crossings, tracking refugees, and intercepting them before they could reach safety elsewhere. There are documented cases of people who were arrested at border crossings, held briefly in one country, then transported to another where they disappeared. The borders that should have provided some measure of protection, or at least bureaucratic complexity, instead became kill zones where multiple intelligence services operated together seamlessly. Europe became another theater for Condor operations, though more limited and cautious than operations within South America. The attempted assassination of Bernardo Leighton in Rome showed that even European capitals weren't safe. In Paris, which hosted large communities of Chilean, Argentine, and Uruguayan exiles, Condor operatives conducted surveillance gathered intelligence about exile organizations, and reported back to their home countries. There were several mysterious deaths and disappearances of South American refugees in Europe during this period that bear the hallmarks of intelligence operations, though proving direct connections has been difficult because the operatives were more careful about leaving evidence when working in countries where they couldn't rely on local government cooperation. The question of what precisely the United States knew about Operation Condor, when it knew it, and what it did or didn't do in response remains contentious because significant portions of the relevant documents remain classified even decades later. What has been declassified shows that by 1976, American intelligence agencies had detailed information about Condor's existence and operations. A September 1976 State Department cable, sent just days before the Letelier assassination, described Operation Condor as an intelligence-sharing arrangement among Southern Cone countries that was being expanded to include plans for assassination operations against enemies living abroad. The cable expressed concern that these assassination operations might extend to targets in Europe and even the United States. The timing is striking. American officials knew that Condor was planning assassinations abroad. They knew this just days before Letelier was killed in Washington. Yet no effective action was taken to warn potential targets or to pressure the Condor countries to halt these operations. After the Letelier bombing, when the connection to Chilean intelligence became undeniable, the Carter administration did impose some sanctions on Chile and reduced military cooperation. But the broader Condor system continued to operate with other member countries for several more years, and American intelligence maintained relationships with the same agencies conducting Condor operations. The question of American complicity has multiple layers. At the most basic level, the United States provided training, equipment, and doctrine to the military and intelligence services that created Condor. The School of the Americas and other training programs taught counterinsurgency methods. American advisors worked with Latin American security forces. The national security doctrine that justified treating entire civilian populations as potential enemies reflected ideas that had originated in American military thinking about guerrilla warfare and communist infiltration. The dictatorships didn't invent these concepts from nothing. They learned them, adapted them, and took them to extremes that even their American teachers claimed not to have intended. At a deeper level, the United States created the geopolitical context in which Condor could exist. American support for anti-communist regimes, regardless of their methods, sent a clear signal about what was acceptable. The history of American intervention in Latin America, from Guatemala in 1954 to the Bay of Pigs to ongoing operations in Central America, established that the U.S. would tolerate or actively support extreme violence if it served anti-communist objectives. The Southern Cone militaries understood that their campaigns of repression would not trigger American opposition as long as they positioned themselves as anti-communist allies. They were correct. But there's also a third level, more direct and more damning. Declassified documents show that American intelligence maintained relationships with the very intelligence services conducting Condor operations. The CIA worked with DINA, with Argentine intelligence, with the other Condor members. They shared information. They coordinated on issues of mutual interest. Even as evidence accumulated about disappearances, torture, and assassination, these relationships continued. At what point does maintaining an intelligence relationship with an organization conducting systematic human rights violations cross from tacit approval into active complicity? That question has never been fully answered, because the complete documentary record remains hidden. Operation Condor began to unravel in the early 1980s as the dictatorships themselves started to collapse. Argentina's military regime humiliated by defeat in the Falklands War and facing economic catastrophe, began its retreat from power in 1982 and handed over to civilian government in 1983. Uruguay's military, facing mounting domestic opposition and international pressure, agreed to a transition back to democracy completed in 1985. Brazil's dictatorship, which had been gradually liberalizing through the late 1970s, fully transitioned to civilian rule in 1985. Chile held on longer under Pinochet, but even there, a 1988 plebiscite rejected continued military rule and democracy was restored in 1990. Paraguay's Stroessner was finally overthrown in a coup in 1989. As these transitions occurred, the intelligence services that had run Condor operations scrambled to destroy evidence. Files were burned, documents were shredded, computer databases were wiped. Operatives who knew too much were sometimes quietly eliminated by their own services to prevent them from testifying. The militaries tried to negotiate amnesty as part of the transition deals, legal guarantees that they wouldn't be prosecuted for crimes committed while in power. In some countries, they succeeded. Chile gave Pinochet immunity. Brazil passed broad amnesty laws. Uruguay initially granted amnesty that was later upheld in a referendum. But Argentina took a different path. The new democratic government of Raúl Alfonsín, elected in 1983, established a truth commission to investigate the disappearances and then did something almost unprecedented. It put the junta leaders on trial in civilian courts. The trials, held in 1985, produced devastating testimony about the machinery of repression, including the coordination with other countries through Operation Condor. Survivors testified about being rendered from one country to another. Documents were presented showing the intelligence sharing and joint operations. For the first time, Condor was being exposed in an open court with legal proceedings that created a permanent public record. The convictions of Argentina's junta leaders in 1985 sent a signal across the region that accountability was possible. But the path proved neither straight nor easy. Military pressure led to the full stop and due obedience laws that halted most prosecutions. Presidential pardons in the 1990s freed even those who had been convicted. For years, it seemed that the perpetrators had achieved impunity through political maneuvering. Human rights organizations continued to document cases, to gather evidence, to identify perpetrators. But the courts were closed to them. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. In 1992, a Paraguayan judge named José Agustín Fernández was investigating police corruption when he discovered something extraordinary. Hidden in a police station outside Asunción were the archives of Alfredo Stroessner's dictatorship, hundreds of thousands of documents that somehow had not been destroyed during the transition. The archives of terror, as they became known, contained detailed records of Operation Condor. There were lists of targets, reports of operations, correspondence between intelligence services, evidence of coordination and joint actions. The documents proved what human rights organizations had long claimed, but couldn't definitively prove: that Condor was real, systematic, and involved all the countries accused of participating. The archives of terror became crucial evidence in the long struggle for justice. Combined with other documents that surfaced over time, testimony from perpetrators who eventually talked, and the persistent work of investigative journalists and human rights lawyers, a detailed picture of Operation Condor emerged. In the 2000s, as political conditions in South America shifted and new governments more committed to human rights came to power, the legal landscape changed. Argentina's Supreme Court declared the amnesty laws unconstitutional. Trials resumed and have continued, with hundreds of former military and intelligence officers convicted for crimes, including those committed through Condor operations. In 2013, an Argentine court handed down the first verdicts specifically for Condor operations as a criminal conspiracy. Former military and intelligence officers from Argentina and Uruguay were convicted for the kidnapping and disappearance of refugees in Buenos Aires in the 1970s. The court ruled that Operation Condor constituted a criminal conspiracy to commit crimes against humanity across international borders. It was a legal landmark, establishing that even coordinated actions between governments could be prosecuted as criminal conspiracy when those actions violated fundamental human rights. The legacy of Operation Condor extends far beyond the specific cases of those who were kidnapped, tortured, or killed. It represented a fundamental violation of the international order that emerged after World War II. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Geneva Conventions, the principles enshrined in the UN Charter, all of these established frameworks meant to prevent governments from committing atrocities against their own people and to protect refugees fleeing persecution. Condor violated every one of these principles systematically. It showed that Cold War imperatives could override international law, that anti-communist credentials could excuse almost any crime, that borders provided no protection when governments agreed to cooperate in repression. The system worked because it exploited the gaps in international justice. No single country had jurisdiction over crimes that spanned multiple nations. International criminal law was still underdeveloped. The International Criminal Court didn't exist yet. The countries conducting Condor operations were the same countries that would have to prosecute them, and they had no intention of holding themselves accountable. It took decades for legal mechanisms to develop that could address these transnational crimes, and even now, the process remains incomplete. For the survivors and the families of victims, Operation Condor represents a particular form of trauma. Your loved one didn't just disappear or die. They were hunted across borders. They fled seeking safety and found that nowhere was safe. The very act of escape, which should have provided some measure of protection, led them into traps where multiple governments coordinated to capture them. The psychological impact of that realization, that there was no sanctuary, that the entire continent had become a hunting ground, adds another dimension to the horror. Operation Condor stands as one of the Cold War's darkest chapters, a demonstration of how ideological conflict between superpowers translated into coordinated repression against civilian populations. It showed what governments were willing to do when they believed they faced an existential threat and when they believed that more powerful allies would tolerate or support those actions. The fact that it operated for nearly a decade, that it conducted operations on multiple continents, that it kidnapped and killed with impunity, reflects the moral failures not just of the Southern Cone dictatorships, but of the international system that enabled them. The mothers and fathers, sons and daughters, husbands and wives who were disappeared through Condor operations remain largely forgotten outside their home countries. Their names aren't widely known. Their stories aren't taught in most history books. But they were real people, caught up in a system that treated human life as expendable in service of ideology, that saw refugees as legitimate targets, that believed borders could be erased when hunting enemies. Remembering them, understanding what happened to them and why, remains essential not just for historical accuracy, but as a warning. When governments decide that security justifies any method, when international cooperation serves repression rather than justice, when ideological struggle overrides human rights, the result is systems like Operation Condor. The Condor still soars over the Andes, but now it should remind us not of predatory efficiency, but of how easily the machinery of states can be turned against the people it's supposed to protect.